Hello everyone, welcome to part 2 of the Patreon Drydock. So, well, you all know why you're here at this point, so let's start off with a question, shall we? Vintage Car History asks, why do British naval officers have loops on their uppermost rank bar on their dress coats and US officers do not? The origins of the curl or loop, as modelled here by Admiral Jellicoe, are somewhat lost to time. There's a lot of competing theories as to what exactly was the origin of these things. However, the one I find the most convincing personally is that obviously these things were introduced sort of towards the Napoleonic Wars and into the 19th century in graduation. First, it was you have to have distinctive cuffs, and gradually by kind of the middle of the 1800s, it had roughly settled down to the format you see here. But I think it's a product of that. So there were a lot of variations initially. If you look at paintings and wood carvings and prints, etc., of the 1700s, you'll notice that various Royal Navy admirals might have the gold braiding, but where roughly there is the loop, you might find all sorts of fancy designs. And the loop is just the simplest and easiest one, and I think that's probably how it ended up being the standard. Somebody was just kind of looking at it going, well, all these different slightly personalised tailored designs are very confusing. Which one's the easiest to do and the least confusing for everyone and can be potentially manufactured in bulk if necessary? Well, we'll go with the loop. And that's kind of been inherited by a lot of Commonwealth navies as well, rather understandably. But other navies, as you noted, the US Navy doesn't follow that practice. I suspect if it had been Royal Navy practice in the early to mid 1700s, before the US set itself up as its own country, then, as with a number of other things that the US Navy inherited from the Royal Navy, they probably would have taken it on. But by the time the Royal Navy settled down to this uniform standard, the US was very much its own thing. And instead, if you look at photos or paintings of US admirals, you'll notice that roughly where you would find the loop on a British admiral, there is in fact instead a star on a US admiral. Aurora asks, what would the consequences be if the British continued construction of the rest of the Admiral class to Hood's improved design? Incidentally, this is the Admiral class HMS Rodney under construction. Recently, the IWM has magically discovered a whole sheaf of photos that show the rest of the Admiral class under construction. So this shows you some idea of roughly what stage, at least in this case, Rodney was at some point. Obviously not taken right at the end of her pause in construction, but yeah, there you go. They were actually being built. Nonetheless, if the British do actually complete the other three Admiral class, so you now have a class of 4, then at the Washington Treaty, this could pose some problems, because whilst ignoring grandfathering in Hood was doable, ultimately she doesn't have the same caliber of armament. Everyone seems very obsessed at the Washington Treaty with having 16-inch guns, but she is obviously considerably above the standard displacement. But, as I've mentioned before, the US Navy had kind of ballparked Hood's combat power at the time as approximately equivalent to a Colorado class, and superior to any of the 14-inch standards. So this perhaps also explains why the US was happy to settle for 3 16-inch Colorados, but the British only got 2 Nelsons, because the US negotiators are effectively ballparking, going, right, well, Hood is approximately the same combat power as a 16-inch battleship, so if the British have Hood, Rodney and Nelson, and we have Colorado, West Virginia and Maryland, and then the Japanese have Nagato and Mutsu, then that roughly balances everything out. If you get to the Washington Treaty and you've got 4 Admiral class in the water, this presents something more of a problem, because the British will still be wanting a 16-inch ship, because as I mentioned, everyone's slightly obsessed with that figure, but they already have 4 ships that are broadly of equivalent combat power, at which point I think The US is definitely going to insist on completing Washington to have the 4 Colorados, and they may be quite resistant to the idea of the British building Rodney and Nelson, because in their mind that would give the British the equivalent of 6 fully modern capital ships by their ratings. The Japanese, of course, would be arguing to have at least 1 or more additional capital ships of a 16-inch armament. Of course, they are in the process of building the Tosas and the Amagis, and the US is building the South Dakotas. The British have technically laid down the G3s. So the negotiations would be very fraught and difficult, I think, because the British wouldn't really be of too much of a mind to scrap something, because in theory they would have them all completed, whereas the Americans and the Japanese would still be completing theirs. So one potential argument would be that the British don't get any 16-inch ships, the Americans complete all 4 Colorados, and the Japanese maybe get a Tosa, or get told they can build another Nagato, more likely. The other thing is that potentially the standard displacement may be raised, because, as I said, it's easier to ignore 1 oversized ship, slightly harder to ignore 4 of them, at which point balances may be sought with perhaps completing some additional vessels. So perhaps if the British are absolutely determined they want 16-inch ships, maybe they get told, right, well, you can have a couple of G3s. The Americans will probably, given that they want the Lexingtons for carriers at this point, if they're not going to get all of them, will probably go for a couple of the South Dakotas, and the Japanese maybe get a couple of Tosas. So in terms of 16-inch or equivalent modern capital ships, the British and the Americans then each have 6, and the Japanese have 4. As far as the immediate Washington Treaty is concerned, that's probably not going to put too many noses out of joint, because for the Americans, they are sacrificing some 12-inch ships. The British are sacrificing some of the earlier 13.5-inch ships, the King George V's, most likely, maybe some of the Iron Dukes. No one's going to shed too many tears about most of those, so you'd probably end up with, Iron Duke and Centurion sticking around, maybe Iron Duke and Tiger, and the Americans will probably keep Arkansas floating around, similar to what they had at the end of the London Naval Treaty, and then all their 14, 15, and now 16-inch ships. Exactly what the Japanese would do is a bit more interesting, because they'd probably have to give up the Fusos because of the lower numbers that they've got. The more interesting thing's going to come about once you get to the London Naval Treaty. And again, assuming that the London Naval Treaty is negotiated as it was historically, it may not be, because people wanting to keep whole numbers. But if for arbitrary reasons everyone agrees we're going down to 15, and 10 capital ships completely, then, well, if the British have 4 admirals, then they've got 5 Queen Elizabeths and Renown, Repulse, and the 13.5-inch ships. They'll happily drop those, and then they have the Rs, so they would probably end up having to drop an R class in the first case. If they've also got 2 G3s floating around, then they would probably have to drop 3 R class. And for the US, they'd either have to drop Arkansas in the first case, or Arkansas, New York, and Texas in the second. The Japanese, in the first case, where they've got maybe an additional Nagato, they might drop an additional Kongo. So like Hiei went into reserve, they might put a second Kongo into reserve. Or, as I mentioned earlier, they might drop the 2 Fusos to keep the 4 Kongos, 2 Iseis, and now 3 Nagatos in service. Or some combination thereof if they've got a Tosa as well, or 2. There is, of course, the other option, which would be the much easier option, to be perfectly honest, which would be considering that Anson, Howe, and Rodney, the other 3 Admiral class, were laid down shortly after Hood, all in November, October 1916. Then, if you look at when Hood was launched and completed, and then you take into account the suspension of the construction on the other 3, then maybe continuing construction would be at a slower rate, or maybe there's a brief suspension, and then everything is they're still on the slips, but they're not necessarily fully complete by the time the Washington Treaty negotiations begin, at which point maybe they complete one and do a Saratoga-Lexington-style conversion on the other two. That would be a lot easier. Or maybe they do all three, who knows. Dave Collier asks, in the Royal Navy during the Age of Sail, who was the sailing master, what were his duties, and how did he become one? And yes, I know this is a midshipman, but good luck finding a decent picture of a ship's master that isn't Mr. Allen from Master and Commander. Nonetheless, a sailing master, or ship's master, the terms are interchangeable, is the highest ranking non-commissioned officer on an Age of Sail warship, at least as far as the Royal Navy is concerned. Now, this is actually a very, very old role that actually, well, depending on who you ask, either predates the Royal Navy or it predates the formal founding of the Royal Navy, because if you take the Royal Navy as having been founded by Alfred the Great, then it postdates it. If you take the Royal Navy's formal formation by Henry VIII, then it predates it. Nonetheless, the original point of a sailing master or ship's master was that in the medieval period, a lot of warships were ships that had been hired out from merchant trade by the king for a specific war or campaign. Now, that meant, of course, that the captain would be some form of aristocracy leading a bunch of troops on board, and that person didn't necessarily have the faintest clue about how things worked at sea. Whereas the person who normally commanded the ship in its day-to-day role obviously did, and so they would have to effectively interpret the wishes of either the king or the admiral or the captain into something that vaguely translated into the ship going somewhere without rolling over and sinking immediately. So they were the ones who effectively knew how the ship worked, and as the Royal Navy transitioned over into a more permanent and professional force, and the masters became part of the Navy itself, again, as mentioned earlier, they would become the highest ranking non-commissioned officers. So they were approximated to be around about the same level as a lieutenant, although officially technically below them, but above a midshipman, who technically was the lowest rank of, well, not necessarily commissioned officer, but they were on the commissioned officer's track. To become one, you had to take an exam, and you could do that either from the merchant trade, so you could be a merchant captain and decide you wanted to go into the Navy as a sailing master. You'd take an exam. If you passed the exam, you could then be appointed to a ship or hired to a ship, or you could work your way up the ranks from the general seaman, or you could actually do a little bit of a sideways shift from midshipman over to sailing master if for whatever reason you didn't want to or couldn't pass your lieutenant's exam. As far as your duties were concerned, again, it was mainly navigation and logbook keeping and translating the orders of your officers, who, although by this point should know a bit more about how the ship was handled, may not necessarily be the world's best for handling ships generally. And specifically, especially if they've just transferred over, if, say, they'd previously been a frigate captain and were now on a ship of the line, or had been on a ship of the line and were now on a frigate, they may not know all of the ins and outs of that particular vessel, whereas the master who'd been with the ship for a while would. So they'd do the general inspections of the ship, and let's say if the captain of the ship says, right, I want to come about 3 points to port, well, that's his desire. The master will then translate that into, what forms of changes need to be made to the sails. He'd usually be at the wheel, and so he'd make the precise rudder adjustments, etc. So he's effectively the translator for the officers into action, and as a result needs to know practically everything there is to know about the ship, how to run it, how to fix it, and what bits should be in which locations. Avoid Shisnos asks, during World War II, how advanced was the understanding and measurement of metallurgy? Was it something close to the modern understanding, or was it still comparatively primitive? By World War II, metallurgy was a pretty advanced science. The main difference, I think, between then and now, at least when it comes to manufacturing battleship armour plate and so forth, is that they didn't have the really exotic stuff that you see perhaps in modern tanks and so forth. But even though it was still basically steel with different trace elements included and different preparation methods, which these days you might think everyone knows most of what there is to know about how to make steel. Back then, of course, communication, etc., you didn't have the internet, you didn't have some of the other forms of mass communication that were developed later in the 20th century, and so it was much easier to keep specific advances secret for longer. And not all things about metallurgy were completely understood. Some things, when it comes to how metallurgy works, especially when it comes to the interaction of shells with armor plate, is really assisted by really high-speed photography and computer simulations, neither of which, of course, were available in World War II. You had to basically fire something at a plate like this and then examine the results and try and work out what happened, which did occasionally lead people to go off slightly blind alleys of development, like I think it's Midvale leading the charge on trying to make more unbreakable shells, and concluding that the only way to break or resist the unbreakable shells was to make the face of US armor plate, the hard face, deeper and deeper, which turned out to actually be the wrong thing to do. But it's kind of, they ended up in the little spiral of their own making. But overall, the level of metallurgical knowledge was quite high, and you can see that in the way they build ships. So you had construction grade steel that was used for building the ship generally, and then you would have homogeneous armor plate, which in the US you'd call Class B plate, or could be called high tensile steel, Ducol steel, etc., etc., etc. And then you also had face hardened plate in the US Class A armor, which was usually your turret face plate and always your belt armor and so forth. And all of these had different properties, different alloy mixtures, different preparation techniques. And then, of course, particularly with the Germans and the British, they advanced during the interwar period a little bit more in terms of introducing trace elements to improve the physical properties of the steel that they were using, particularly in face-hardened armor. And when you're looking at just how small some of those trace elements like molybdenum, etc., that are included in those World War II armor mixtures for those countries, you realize they actually had to know an awful lot about how that was going to interact with the rest of the material, which is obviously mostly iron and carbon, with other trace elements as well, like nickel and so forth. They had to understand that to an incredible degree in order to get a consistent product that was useful in terms of battleship protection. And they also had to understand the phase shift areas in terms of temperature, so to avoid the kind of issues that early iron-hulled warships had in the first half of the 19th century, where too cold water could make the steel suddenly rigid, and behave in a very different way to if they were in warmer waters. Obviously back then it was iron, but steel can suffer the same properties if you use the wrong type. And the ship's guns are another example of how well they understood the metallurgy, because, I've mentioned in passing just how complicated manufacturing a ship's gun is, and at some point I probably should do a Wednesday video on that, but to get something as complicated and multi-part as a battleship's gun barrel to not only be manufactured to the necessary tolerances, but to be able to repeatedly manufacture that thing to the necessary tolerances so that you could equip a whole class of battleship or multiple classes of battleship with the same gun, with the same performance characteristics, that requires a significant degree of both engineering and intellectual knowledge of how the metallurgy of the gun and its components is going to work. Nick Brodar asks, during World War II, the US Navy used a large number of different camouflage schemes, changing from low visibility to dazzle, back to low visibility, etc., etc. Also, due to the vastly differing sea and battle conditions, the Pacific and Atlantic fleets used different colour schemes. Did other navies on both sides use as many diverse camouflage schemes or change them as frequently? Yes, there were a lot of changes with camouflage schemes in different navies, apart from the US Navy. Obviously, the German Navy didn't change its camouflage schemes too much. They had one for the Baltic, they had one for the Atlantic, and they had some general, mostly flat colour schemes as well, but with relatively few operational areas and relatively few ships. Whilst there is some changes, there's not huge numbers. The Italians, likewise, have mostly stuck to the Mediterranean, so their ships tended to stay roughly the same in appearance, although they did change up paint schemes a few times here and there. The Japanese had a reasonable amount of variation going in both colour and scheme, but the ones who had the most diverse, alongside the US Navy, perhaps unsurprisingly, given that, like the US Navy, they were fighting all across the planet and had a large number of ships to paint, were the Royal Navy. And just looking through some of the capital ship colour schemes can get very confusing because, if anything, the Royal Navy is perhaps even more all over the place than the US Navy, because at least the US Navy had some degree of standards to apply. So, you know, MS this or whatever, MS insert number here scheme. And generally most ships would comply with that. Whereas if you look through the camouflage scheme histories of various British warships, even just looking at the battleships, virtually no two capital ships have the same camouflage scheme history. So, for example, King George V, when she enters service, she has this kind of patchwork of light and dark grey, but she goes through 3 or 4 different iterations of that before briefly becoming just a plain mid-grey, and then going back to the patchwork, but now introducing blue and white, and then going back to a kind of mid to dark grey, but with a coloured block or bar roughly around about the belt armour and plus or minus a little bit, which is usually seen in the Pacific on a lot of British warships, and that changes in colour a couple of times as well. And then, you know, so that's King George V, but Prince of Wales, in her brief career, is a much, much darker grey, which King George V doesn't seem to have ever had, and then is a plain mid-grey, then goes for the multicolour spectrum several times, then goes over to this sort of pale grey, very dark grey, and blue patchwork, which shows up on various British ships at various points, and it's in approximately that colour scheme that she's actually sunk. Rodney really likes multiple colours, especially involving blue, but also at points in the war has a sort of a darker grey hull and a lighter grey upperworks, which you'll see relatively often on a number of British ships. And, you know, things go on like that. Renown as well is another one that is rather beloved of the multiple colours, although also spends some time in single plain colours. Warspite never really goes in for the colours, but does have varying shades of grey, and all of these varying colour schemes are very different to each other. So, yeah, and that's just some of the Royal Navy's capital ships, let alone the aircraft carriers, the cruisers, the destroyers, etc., etc. HMS Howe, which is the picture for this question, by the way, in case you're wondering, is in this image sporting her mid-war colour scheme, which is a mixture of light grey, mid-grey, dark grey, and pale blue in variegating patches. So what you're seeing here, I think, if I'm reading the camouflage schemes correctly, is that the bow there is actually, that little bow patch forward of the anchor is actually a very pale blue, and then the next part behind is a kind of a grey colour. The changing of colour you can see on the belt is between a mid-grey and a dark grey, and as you can see, her upper works are in, generally speaking, a much paler grey. Miles McCaskill asks, I've come up with an idea and I'm curious to know if it was ever attempted and how well you think it could have worked, if at all. So you have ships in a battle line of the same class pairing up and use a large clock, similar to a range clock, to synchronise their fire exactly 180 degrees apart from each other in order to differentiate one ship's shell splashes from the other. For example, if we take a class of British battleships at the Battle of Jutland that has a rate of fire in battle of 1 broadside a minute, if you equip the ships with a clock that has a 70-second rotation, with the extra 10 seconds added to account for a diminishing rate of fire during battle, so you would ensure that the ships are able to maintain a firing schedule as the battle goes on. Battleship A would fire its full broadside at every 0 mark on the clock, while Battleship B would fire at every 30 to 35 second mark. If each ship fires 1 full broadside every 70 seconds, because the time of flight at a given range would be known, when the salvo lands it should be obvious which ship the salvo belonged to, and thus it should be easier to make corrections and walk the following full broadside closer to the target. Was anything like this ever contemplated or attempted, and do you think it could have helped improve the British hit rate during the death ride of the battle cruisers if the British had used this to organise themselves into a series of 2v1s on all the other ships in it, and all the other ships in excess of that had held their fire? The closest, I think, to that system would be the one that was devised by the Russian pre-dreadnoughts in the Black Sea in order to allow them to take on the ex-German Goeben, now Yavuz Sultan Selim of the Ottoman Navy, and they used a relatively similar system. Of course, they were also sharing ranges, so the idea was that one ship would estimate the range, and they would then transmit that down to the other ships in the line, and the other ships, of course, would be able to make a much more accurate estimation of where they were relative to the lead ship, or whichever ship down the line they were behind, and then they could factor in that to calculate if the lead ship says the range is this, and we're here relative to the lead ship and relative to the target, then the range must therefore be this, and then we can coordinate fire. So kind of like the Japanese were planning with the Matsushima class, you effectively have one Gestalt ship that's firing using the same set of data. Offhand, I don't know if they also staggered their fire to more accurately calculate their salvos, but it would seem to be something that would be logical to do. Now, this kind of partner system that you suggest, it would make a certain degree of sense, and potentially could work relatively well. There are, however, 2 problems. One would be, how do you designate the target in the first place? So if we use your Death Ride example, let's say Iron Duke and whichever ship is behind her at the time decide, right, we're going to concentrate fire on, I don't know, Moltke. How do you tell everybody else that you're firing on Moltke? And, how do you prevent the next pair or down the line or the next pair after them from also firing on Moltke instead of Von der Tann? That is a whole other issue, because, of course, you don't necessarily know that ship is Moltke. You might, if your rangefinders are good enough and you get a good enough look, say, yes, well, this looks somewhat like Moltke, but you also might not have a clear enough view to say that. So, if you decide, all right, I'm going to engage the lead ship, then you'd still have to have some form of way of signalling the next pair, right, I'm engaging the lead ship, or we, I guess, are engaging the lead ship, you need to engage the second ship, and also hope that, due to perspective changes, that everybody agrees what the first, second, and third ships in the line are. And of course, these kinds, just that basic kind of, I'll engage this, you engage that, was practiced in World War I, for example, at Jutland, but some of the problems you see with that, you see during the run to the south, where in theory the British battlecruisers should have had at least one ship engaging every German battlecruiser and doubling up on one of the targets, but it actually worked out that there was unintentional doubling which hindered their accuracy of fire, and Der Flinger was left unengaged for a good long while. So that's another part of the system that you'd have to work out. The other issue is that if you're doing a series of 2v1s or something like this, it assumes that you have the numerical superiority for this to actually be useful. So even though the Grand Fleet significantly outnumbered the High Seas Fleet, and the Battlecruiser Fleet outnumbered First Scouting Group, and even more so once 5th Battle Squadron showed up, there were very, very few points, even at something the scale of Jutland, where 2v1 superiority was assured. I mean, technically, if the entire battlecruiser fleet, including 5th Battle Squadron, had shown up together, thanks BT, then they would have had 2v1 against 1st Scouting Group, but by the time 5th Battle Squadron was able to catch up, they'd lost Indefatigable and Queen Mary, so it wasn't quite 2v1. And yeah, pretty much the death ride of the battlecruisers is the only point at which the odds were 2v1 or greater. So you'd also have to have some kind of system that would tell other ships, okay, well, we're not using this system right this instant, because otherwise you'd end up with potentially overwhelming fire on some targets, but you'd leave other targets unengaged. So I think this kind of system, it could be made to work in some way, shape or form, maybe not necessarily using a range clock, maybe using radio or something like that. But the technology to make it work is perhaps more suited to World War II, where you could at least use voice radio to make short announcements to arrange things. But at the same time, of course, in World War II, you generally don't see mass battle line engagements where you would need this kind of system. Whereas in World War I, it might be quite useful to be able to adopt it at specific intervals, but I don't think the technology was quite there to be able to reliably pull it off, unless you knew that you were probably persistently going to run into a specific kind of issue, which the Russians, with their pre-dreadnoughts in the Black Sea, knew that they would, because if they were going to run into anything, it was going to be Yavuz, and so they had to prepare for that. Manani Wanderer asks, you've made frequent mention of poor quality control in regards to Italian munitions during the Second World War, and I'm wondering, how exactly do you do quality control for charge bags and shells? Just picking some at random and firing them seems to be a bit too simple, given that any problems could be the result of a bad charge, a bad shell, or both. So there are quite a few different elements to quality control when it comes to the charges and the shells. One of the simplest ones is to take a random sample and weigh them, because the weight of the shell will influence how far it goes and what its balance might be, and the weight of the charge, obviously, if it weighs more, it might have more explosive than it's supposed to, and if it weighs less, it might have less explosive than it's supposed to. So if you, say, took a US modern fast battleship of World War II, then you could take your Mark 8 shell and weigh it and go, right, is this within tolerance, which might be plus or minus 1%, or whatever percentage the particular navy wants to use, but would usually be fairly low. Does this shell weigh within the tolerances of what this shell should weigh? If so, great. You can potentially also look for balance points, but assuming that it's within the weight tolerances, it's relatively unlikely to be out of balance. With the charges, you would do the same thing. So for the 16-inch 45, does this charge bag weigh 90 pounds? For the 16-inch 50, does this charge bag weigh 110 pounds? Plus or minus a small amount. Another thing you can do is open up carefully a charge to have a look, because of course the outer bag is silk, and as you can see in this example, this would be a cordite charge. You would look to make sure that all the sticks of cordite are of the same length and all neatly arranged as they need to be. And in a powder charge bag, like say with the US Navy's ones, you'd look again for neat arrangement and correct amount of layering and correct density. Because even if it weighs the right amount, if things are uneven or not arranged properly, that's going to lead to issues with the combustion, which might throw things off. So once you're satisfied that the charges and the shells weigh the correct amount and on visual inspection have been assembled approximately correctly, then you can also go on to firing them. Because obviously there will be some issues that you can't detect by weighing and visual inspection, and that will tell you a few things like, is the combination going to work? If you fire it at armor plate rather than just randomly off into the sea, it might also tell you if the fuse is going to initiate, and there were quality control issues with that obviously in both wars for different navies. So all of these things would give you a general picture as to whether or not you could expect your average charge and your average shell to work. Of course, another vital part of quality control is making the sample sets truly random. Because if you just turn up and go, right, well, you've manufactured 12 batches of charges and 200 shells, so we're going to pick the 7th, 67th, 114th and 163rd shells, and we're going to take charges from that batch, that batch, that batch, and that batch, check them, and then fire them. You'll probably get a reasonable idea of what the general state of the shells and charges are. Whereas if you send a letter in advance to the ammunition factory and you say, well, you know, in 2 weeks we're coming to do a quality control inspection, so please have a batch of shells and charges ready for us to look at, somewhat unsurprisingly, you'll probably find this very careful selected batch that the factory has ensured is ready for you is absolutely perfectly to standard, and that really doesn't tell you anything about the general quality. A Salty Potato asks, I've been reading up on Royal Navy pennant numbers, and I have to wonder, why are they so confusing? Certain letters would be used for one type of warship, and they would suddenly be used for another class, as well as numbers being reused for new ships. Why didn't they swap over to hull numbers like the US Navy, which is much easier to understand? I mean, they kept changing their minds about how they wanted things to work, which didn't help, but there were a number of other factors. As you mentioned, if a ship was sunk, its pennant number would be reused, so a pennant number might apply to one ship at one point in time, but it might a year later might apply to a completely different ship. Then you also have, as I said, the fact that they keep changing their ideas about how the system should be organised, so everything gets reorganised, everybody gets a new number. And then even within the same system, sometimes they'd swap letters over. So a ship might be under the same pennant system, but just a minor alteration might change its both pennant letter and pennant number entirely. And then the choices even within those systems sometimes don't make a huge amount of sense. So, for example, let's take HMS Warspite. So through both World War I and II, she was variously assigned the number 03, 12, 57, A9 and IO3. And really helpfully, they decided to also change the system in the middle of World War II. So they had a system in World War I, they had a separate system by the start of World War II, and in 1939, in theory, the battleships and battlecruisers had a pennant number that was just a number. If you were a cruiser or an aircraft carrier, you had an I and then your number. Submarines didn't have a number either, but they had basically a small letter that indicated your class. The destroyers would either be D, H or F, because there were more destroyers than there were the 1 to 99 that you could get in a letter plus two numbers combination. If you were a smaller vessel, like a corvette or something, you would have L, which had previously been F, but with more destroyers, they'd put destroyers over to F and decided L was going to be the thing. Corvette specifically had M, and then tenders were T, etc. But in 1940, they changed that also. Cruisers and aircraft carriers now had a D, followed by the number. Submarines were now N or P. Destroyers had H or I if you'd previously been D, or you were G if you'd previously been F, and now there was a new R designation. The escort destroyers became I, the escort vessels became U, the corvettes and frigates became K, and so on and so forth. Battleships and battlecruisers theory still had nothing, and it kind of goes on and on and on like this. And even then they didn't actually follow their own instructions, so for example, at the beginning of World War II, if you look at the non-lettered pennant numbers, it starts off looking vaguely like someone was organised, with the Queen Elizabeths followed by the Revenges, but then it very rapidly devolves into this mess of carriers followed by cruisers, who are, as in both cases, are supposed to have a letter, but now they don't. And you have Duke of York, which is obviously a fairly modern King George V class battleship, being assigned pennant 17, but Iron Duke Jellicoe's old flagship at Jutland is pennant number 18, and immediately before that you have the cruiser Edinburgh with pennant 16, and immediately after you have the cruiser Birmingham with 19. Then Vanguard gets 23. Lion, which was obviously never built, ends up with allocated 27. But Nelson, which has been around for quite a while, gets allocated 28, followed by Rodney, which I guess shows a certain degree of logic, with 29. And similarly, even where you have pennant letters which are supposed to be for specific types or classes of ship, you usually end up with interlopers in there as well. So, personally, I don't really understand what they were doing with it. I'm sure there was someone somewhere who thought it made sense, but I have a suspicion they may be from a different dimension. The Freaker 86 asks, do you think that Bismarck and Prinz Eugen should have disregarded the explicit order given by Naval Command and should have gone after Prince of Wales after Hood was sunk? Do you think they would have had a reasonable chance of sinking Prince of Wales? And do you think they would have been able to sink Norfolk and Suffolk as well? No, I don't think it would have been a good idea, because bear in mind that in the exchange of gunfire, Prince of Wales hit Bismarck before Bismarck hit Prince of Wales, and granted Bismarck was initially firing at Hood, but nonetheless Prince of Wales got the first hits of the entire engagement. In terms of overall hits, Prince of Wales and Bismarck were matched. They'd each scored a pair of hits on each other, but the hits that Prince of Wales had scored on Bismarck at that point were far more important than the hits scored by Bismarck on Prince of Wales. Bismarck had managed to kill some of the bridge crew and put a hole that actually most people hadn't actually noticed with a dud shell below the waterline. Prince of Wales, on the other hand, had also managed a diving shot, but that had breached one of the boiler rooms and caused a loss of power and flooding, and of course the hit up front that caused a big hole in the bow, which cut off fuel, left a fuel slick, and would reduce Bismarck's speed. And all of that is quite important, because it means if Bismarck had chosen to continue the engagement, she would have to continue at high speed for a relatively prolonged period of time, possibly with manoeuvring. And we know the issues that Bismarck's crew had trying to stem the flooding in the bow whenever Bismarck had to move at speed, such as later on when she was trying to evade the torpedo strikes from aircraft. So if Bismarck had done a 180 to chase Prince of Wales back towards Norfolk and Suffolk, then you would have had, Norfolk and Suffolk would have been able to gang up on Prinz Eugen or support Prince of Wales, depending on what arrangement the ships were in when they all arrive in gun range of each other. And that's not a particularly brilliant arrangement for Prinz Eugen to be in, because both Norfolk and Suffolk are pretty good with their gunnery. So, reasonably speaking, you can expect the two counties to handle the one hipper. At which point, you've got a initial showdown between Prince of Wales and Bismarck, which will probably then be added to by one or both counties once they've dealt with Prinz Eugen. And as we've already pointed out, despite having occasional gun jams and occasional turret jams, Prince of Wales's gunnery was still pretty good on the day. She would have had time during her retreat back to Norfolk and Suffolk to sort out some of those gunnery issues, so she might have been losing guns here and there, but also regaining them. Sometimes her issues with her guns are a little bit overblown in certain literature, although they were definitely present. And you have to account for the fact that if Bismarck is charging at speed and then manoeuvring and engaging at speed, all that time she's going to be suffering from continued progressive flooding through the bow, in addition to whatever damage other hits might accumulate. Plus, obviously, her radar is down. So the longer the engagement goes on, the worse it's going to be for Bismarck, unless she can score a lucky hit on Prince of Wales, which is very unlikely, because regardless of which of the particular theories you believe about Hood exploding, if you look at the two that actually physically work, ignore the nonsense about torpedo warheads exploding or straight penetration of the belt and all of this kind of stuff. But if you just look at the two that actually are reasonable, i.e. the one that I propose, where you have the trough and the shell diving under the belt, or if you potentially look at the one which I believe is somewhat flawed in concept, but physically is possible if the mechanics and the circumstances line up, or obviously I disagree with it, which is potentially coming through the upper belt or the 7-inch belt and or some kind of very weird angle shot. But nonetheless, Prince of Wales doesn't have either of those weaknesses. So because her belt runs deeper and her deck is all or nothing solid slab. So Prince of Wales isn't going to just randomly explode. It's going to be a knockdown drag-out fight, and it's a knockdown drag-out fight where Prince of Wales is probably going to end up with late-game support from one or more cruisers, and Bismarck is going to be basically punishing itself every moment it's still running at speed, as I said, through the progressive flooding in the bow, which is going to slow it down. It's going to throw off its ability to shoot. It may begin to compromise its buoyancy if it gets too bad. So, yeah, it's not a fight that Bismarck really is in a particular shape to win. She might. All things are possible, of course, but the odds are very much stacked against her. Reichspeer Minister asks, how did it come about that you name ships after women, put partially naked women on the bow of said ships as figureheads, but women themselves are considered bad luck aboard ships? Well, why ships have a female name, usually, depending on the culture, is something we've talked about in previous Drydocks and is a very complicated subject in and of itself. But broadly speaking, the figureheads that you see, some sources indicate that the rather common use of a partially or fully naked female form as a figurehead was to do with superstition that women made better navigators, and that a partially or fully unclothed woman, even in figurehead form, would shame the sea gods into giving the ship calm weather, because, a divine being must observe all rules of propriety, so you can't cast an angry gaze upon a ship if, there's a naked woman at the front, because you have to look away from that, was the logic, which I suppose tracks if you believe in that kind of thing. But when it comes to women aboard ship, now that's a rather interesting one, because on the one hand you do have this commonly stated thing these days that women aboard ships were considered bad luck. On the other hand, there's a surprising number of women aboard ships in the Age of Sail, even if unofficially. Now obviously you've got the women who disguise themselves as men, albeit obviously the men, if the disguise is successful, they don't know that a woman is aboard a ship. But you would also quite often have the wives of officers aboard ships, and depending on the level of discipline that the captain imposed, you might also have the wives or paramours of some of the lower ranking crew smuggled aboard the ships. And people didn't tend to mind that so much. Whereas you'd think if it was a full cultural belief that they're bad luck, it wouldn't matter what rank the officer was. He still shouldn't be allowed to have his wife or lover aboard a ship. And then, of course, you have some navies that spent most of their time near the coast, like, say, the Swedish Navy around the time of Vasa, and they would quite happily have wives of all ranks aboard the ship, at least during times of peace. I have a feeling myself that the idea that a woman aboard a ship might cause problems for the ship, whether that be in the form of general mischief or in the form of bad weather, probably comes about more from the fact that, rather unsurprisingly, if you lock several hundred men aboard a wooden warship for weeks or months at a time, and then you introduce a very small handful of women to the equation, I probably don't need to go into any further detail of just how that might cause some tensions and issues amongst the crew and distract them from doing their duties properly. And when that happens, if they are distracted and they're fractious and they're arguing with each other, then the ship is going to suffer, because they won't, in a storm, if people aren't working fully together, that could be very bad for the ship. And any other circumstance where they have to work together, and also just in terms of general disciplinary issues. At which point, it is somewhat understandable that the officers as a whole wouldn't be particularly in favour of having random women associating with the majority of the crew, and this might therefore codify, at least in the minds of some, to the idea of, well, it's bad luck to have a woman aboard a ship, which in theory it might be, but that's because of the real world issues that might cause, which might also then explain why having an officer's wife aboard a ship maybe isn't considered such bad luck, because A, she'd be separate from most of the rest of the crew most of the time, and B, it would be very clear that she is off limits to the rest of the crew, at which point most of the issues that would arise from, random women on the gun deck would not arise as much as they would otherwise. And I suppose if anyone is dumb enough to go and try and make out with the figurehead, well, the sea's probably going to take them fairly quickly anyway, and you're probably better off without someone with a room temperature IQ like that. Blacksmith Panzer asks, the Type 93 long lance seems like a cursed sword. It's a powerful weapon, but comes with a terrible cost. While it and its variants did help the Japanese achieve some of the most stunning naval victories, it also proved to be extremely dangerous to its users as well. Several Japanese destroyers suffering devastating explosions when the oxygen fuel of the long lance went up, and it even seemed to occasionally give the heavy cruisers an Achilles heel. So my question is, do you think in the end it was worth it? Did the benefits of its increased range, payload and stealth, thanks to little to no bubble trail, outweigh the dangers of its explosive fuel? Or do you think a more traditional torpedo would have done just as well in the situations that the long lance found itself in? I think overall it was probably worth it. When you look at the, obviously mostly in 1942, the most famous results achieved by the long lance and its Type 95 submarine descendant, a lot of those wouldn't have been possible without the long lance, or if the victory was possible, it might have resulted in higher Japanese casualties, which may then have resulted in them having to postpone or finish an operation without achieving what they wanted. So, for example, at the Battle of the Java Sea, would a BDA command have lost a straight-up gunfight and conventional torpedo engagement to the Japanese? Probably, to be perfectly honest. But they very well might have scored some interesting hits on the Japanese in exchange. And Japanese cruisers were not necessarily the best protected in all areas, especially the turrets. And if they'd gotten into a conventional torpedo exchange with both sides having torpedoes of approximately the same range, then obviously there's just as much of a chance of a Japanese cruiser catching a torpedo and folding up like a wet tissue, the same as some of the Allied cruisers did. And then you look at something like Tassafaronga. In theory, if the Japanese had had short-range torpedoes, the same as the US Type 15s on board the destroyers, then that cruiser force at Tassafaronga should have overwhelmed the Japanese destroyer force. But they didn't, because a lot of them ended up getting hit by long lances. So I think if you add up all the situations where Allied ships were damaged or sunk by long lances at ranges beyond which a conventional torpedo would otherwise have been able to reach, and you then take into account within those battles what additional losses the Japanese might have suffered if they'd had conventional range torpedoes and the range had been allowed to close, and then you compare them with number of Japanese ships lost as a result of Type 93s detonating on deck, I think the balance, whilst it's obviously not ideal to have your torpedoes explode on deck, I think the balance overall comes out in favour of the long lance, and therefore, whilst dangerous, it was probably overall worth it. Obviously didn't actually help them win the war, but it helped them inflict more casualties than they probably otherwise would have. Andrew Waite asks, if the war in the Pacific had lasted through to 1946, what is a reasonable date for HMS Vanguard to be fully completed, fully worked up, and fit for service in the Pacific? Could she have arrived in the Pacific in time to take part in Operation Coronet? Coronet was tentatively papered in for March 1946, and historically Vanguard was commissioned in May 1946, which would have been about 2 months thereafter. And she was fully ready by about August. So March, April, May, June, July, August is about 6 months. She would have been, historically 6 months behind Coronet, if Coronet had taken place. However, she was launched in November 1944, and if you look at the typical time between launch and commission for a British battleship, I basically look at the King George V's for the time period, the last two, Anson and Howe, need about a year and 2 months between launch and commissioning. So if we applied that standard to Vanguard, then, well, if she's launched in November 1944, then in theory she should be commissioned in January 1946 or thereabouts, possibly slightly sooner if they were rushing. But that seems a reasonable time, plus or minus a bit. Now, that does only give her 2 months between commissioning and getting over to Coronet, assuming that Coronet takes place on schedule. And that would be pushing it a little bit because, of course, her sea trials, etc., would be very compressed. Effectively, she'd be doing her sea trials in large part on her way to the Pacific. But on the other hand, a lot of the King George V class were sent pretty much into action straight out of dock. Prince of Wales is a little bit of an odd one in that when she sails to fight Bismarck, it's 3-4 months after she's officially commissioned and she's still working up with issues, whereas King George V, Duke of York, Anson and Howe all actually went out on various missions significantly before then. So I think in principle, yes, Vanguard probably could have been in the Pacific just in time for Coronet. Camino John asks, while watching a snippet from Game of Thrones, when the newly crowned Euron Greyjoy watches Yara Greyjoy take the Iron Fleet, and he bellows out the men are to cut down trees and quarter-saw them for new ships, along with the women spinning flax for sails. I know these lines are for dramatic effect, however, how did they cut planks and timber for Age of Sail ships? Were different sawing methods used depending on where the wood was to be used in the ship, and was quarter-sawing actually used? From what I've seen in various shipyard museums like Portsmouth and Chatham, and from what I've read, I don't think quarter sawing was used much at all. It is, I suppose, a very efficient way of using up wood, but it tends to result in lots of smaller, thinner planks, and that's not really what you want for an Age of Sail ship of the line or frigate. You might use quarter sawing, I suppose, to create planks for making ships' boats, or possibly for patching up if the tree that you've got is relatively small and you don't have that much of a saw available. So, for example, if you were related to a question earlier in the Drydock for this week, maybe if you're putting in a shore to make some emergency repairs. But if you're building a seriously large ship, then the really big stuff, the keel and the frame, etc., would be hewn. So that would mostly be chopping work with perhaps a little bit of sawing here and there. But the majority of the large, thick planks that we've been used to make up the hull and then the decks would be cut using a saw pit, as you can see here. And initially that would be human-powered, and then later it would be animal-powered, and then later it would be steam or otherwise mechanically powered. But a saw pit is able to turn very large logs into very large, very relatively thick planks, which are suitable for making a large ship's hull. Whereas, yeah, a quarter sawing method, I suppose if you were going to build something like a Viking longship, it might be suitable for some of the smaller versions of that, but it really isn't suitable for making something the size of any decent-sized warship. HMS Inadvisable asks, incidents such as Typhoon Cobra seem to suggest that the World War II Allied fleet destroyers were trying to do too much with too little. In hindsight, should fleet destroyers have been split into different types for different roles, or was it feasible to make them truly multi-purpose for anti-aircraft, anti-submarine and anti-surface work, without turning them into light cruisers of 5,000 tons or more, or so unstable as they're liable to be sunk in a stiff breeze? And if it is possible to turn them into multi-purpose ships, what would you consider a suitable standard displacement? I mean, it depends on what time period you're looking at, because at the beginning of the war, and even in the middle of the war, to be perfectly honest, a decent-sized Allied destroyer like a Fletcher class or a Tribal or its immediate descendants was perfectly fine in the multi-purpose role. Where you had a lot of the problems that you encounter in something like Typhoon Cobra, well, the weather generally, Obviously the fuel ballasting issues that were mentioned in the video, but also, as mentioned, the increased top weight of the additional anti-aircraft armament and the radar, etc., etc. So in order to accommodate all of that, plus a decent main gun armament, so let's say you want 5 or 6 guns, you want surface search, air search, and gunnery control and anti-aircraft control radar, you want a decent number of 20mm and or 40mm medium and light anti-aircraft guns, plus, at least maybe a couple of triple or a couple of quadruple torpedo launchers, and some depth charge rails on the back, and ASDIC or sonar. I would say that to fit all of that on a reasonably stable hull towards the end of the war, you're probably looking at a ship of about 2,500 to 3,000 tons standard displacement, which, amusingly enough, is the exact bracket that the Gearing and Daring classes, the sort of late and immediately post-war destroyer classes of the US and Royal Navies, happen to fall into. Now, of course, there were ships in this displacement bracket before World War II. Some of the French contre-torpilleurs, some of the larger German destroyers, etc. So if you took something like the hull of a Le Fantasca or a Mogador, and you maybe downrated the machinery a little bit, or you took a Type 1936A and you decided to put something more akin to a destroyer gun rather than a light cruiser armament on it, then you could probably turn those into very effective multi-purpose ships. Richard Sue, I think, asks, you're a new sailor on board a battleship in 1917, about to enter your first naval gunfight against enemy battleships. You lose your nerve and go to hide in a random bathroom on the battleship. Could be anywhere. How safe are you from enemy fire? Would you be safer hiding in the bathroom if you were in a World War II standard battleship sailing into a gunfight? Broadly speaking, looking at the deck plans of both World War I and World War II era battleships, you might be marginally safe compared to some of the more exposed crew from splinters and blast, because the ship's heads tend to be on the centre line of the ship or near enough for the most part. So you're not right near the outer edge of the hull or on the deck. On the other hand, you are near enough in the central third of the ship amidships, which tends to be where most of the hits accumulate, and you are above the armour deck, because below the armour deck is important stuff like engines and magazines and not the ship's heads, which means that if the ship does start taking hits, statistically you're probably in the area that's going to catch the most shell fragments, because if a shell hits the ship and starts heading through, as I mentioned in previous Drydock, you're going to end up with that hole and the resulting shrapnel cloud getting larger and larger and larger, so being amidships at that point is a very bad idea, and as I said, most hits tend to accumulate in the mid-third of the ship, particularly around the bridge superstructure, which also tends to be roughly where most of the heads are. So if the enemy starts landing heavy hits multiple times on you, you're probably better off at your action station. Slam and Sam asks, are there any programs like GUPPY done to other nations' submarines? Whilst the program is a bit beyond the scope of the channel, albeit in some cases only just, then yes, there is a similar program to the GUPPY program that's undertaken at least in the Royal Navy. I'm not sure about other navies, but I suspect probably in the Soviet Navy as well, I would guess. So, for example, this ship that you can see here, or boat, I suppose, this is actually HMS Taciturn. This is a T-class submarine. So gone is the deck gun, gone is the sort of fairing high on the bow with the additional torpedo tubes, and instead you have a bow-mounted sonar, a enlarged and altered sail, and of course machinery, streamlining, etc. has all been upgraded as well. So yeah, the Royal Navy definitely had a similar program, obviously not quite as extensive as the US Navy's, because the US Navy had a lot more submarines to modify apart from anything else, but it certainly did exist in some way, shape or form. My Mum's Basement Needs More Windows asks, what explanation did Admiral Halsey give for his reaction to the World Wonders signal? In his autobiography, Halsey gives a fairly straightforward explanation, which is that when he gets the signal, which includes obviously the incorrectly appended "the world wonders," he viewed it as quite an insult, especially with the stress of various signals coming in already, various people piling signal upon him. Obviously, Kincaid had asked immediately beforehand, where is Admiral Lee? Send Admiral Lee, because obviously the situation down south with Taffy 3 was deteriorating. So Halsey's under a huge amount of stress and pressure at that point, obviously having slightly incorrectly taken Ozawa's bait and run north. And then mixed into all of this, he gets, where is Task Force 34, the world wonders? And in his autobiography, he says, he snatched off my, this is him speaking, he says, the paper rattled in my hands. I snatched off my cap, threw it on the deck, and shouted something I'm ashamed to remember. Mick Carney rushed over and grabbed my arm. Stop it, what the hell's the matter with you? Pull yourself together. He then said, I gave him the dispatch and turned my back. I was so mad I couldn't talk. It was utterly impossible for me to believe that Chester Nimitz would send me such an insult. He hadn't, of course, but I didn't know the truth for several weeks. And then after explaining how that whole thing occurred, he then says that the orders he gave afterwards, he gave in rage, and he's not convinced at the time of writing his autobiography that those orders were the right ones. So, yeah, basically he's under stress, possibly with all these other signals coming in, wondering if he's made the right call, and then it seems like he gets a slap in the face from his superior, basically telling him that he had got it wrong, and just basically sees red for a while. And that's his explanation, which I suppose is probably fairly accurate. Todd Webb asks, if Admiral Fisher attempts the scrap everything that's too slow to run and too weak to fight move a second time, and orders all the pre-dreadnoughts and armoured cruisers scrapped around about the time the Orions and the Lions are coming online, how much does it hurt the Royal Navy not having those hulls for secondary roles? It would hurt quite a bit, actually. On the one hand, situations like the East Asia Squadron would now have to be dealt with straight up by battle cruisers, because if there's no armoured cruisers of any description and no pre-dreadnoughts, well, the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau are armoured cruisers, and everybody knows better than to send just protected cruisers or the Newtown class after them. So I guess it would force the Royal Navy's hand to send one of the I-type battle cruisers down to deal with them, or one or probably two or three maybe, with Town class support. But it would mean an awful lot of secondary theatres aren't covered because there just physically wouldn't be enough ships to go around, which is pretty much why they were kept around, amongst other things. In the Grand Fleet itself, it may not have too much of an effect. I mean, the armoured cruisers generally in the Grand Fleet didn't have all that much to do, except for, in the case of Black Prince and Defence, exploding, and in Warrior's case being horribly beaten up and sunk. And, the pre-dreadnoughts would have been a difficult one, because in 1914, pre-dreadnoughts still made up a good chunk of the Grand Fleet. You've got to remember, pre-dreadnoughts were part of everybody's main battle line at the beginning of World War I, and the British are the first to phase them out, but that's only as more and more ships started to come online in 1914 and 1915. The Germans were about to phase pre-dreadnoughts out of their battle line in 1916, and after Jutland, they did. The two biggest impacts it's going to have in terms of what the Royal Navy feels it can do and how secure it's going to feel is going to be down south. The Harwich Force and the Dover Patrol were supported for a long time during the war by pre-dreadnoughts based in the Thames, which, well, okay, it's not going to stop the High Seas Fleet, but it might provide a decent delay, and it stops anything that's not the High Seas Fleet coming down there. So without the pre-dreadnoughts to cover that, there's going to be questions of how you protect the lighter forces in that area. And, of course, the Gallipoli offensive relied very much on the use of pre-dreadnoughts, and if they're not available, that's going to be a problem. Now, that could be mitigated to a certain extent because some of the monitors that were used later in the war reused turrets from older pre-dreadnoughts like the Majestics. So given that the Orions and the Lions are coming online at the beginning of the 1910s, if the scrapping process is only just beginning as World War I starts, some of the ships might be retrieved, and probably the newest ones, like the Lord Nelsons, the King Edward the Sevenths, and the Warriors, basically the Warrior Duke of Edinburgh, etc., Minotaur classes, they might still be retrieved because they won't yet be being scrapped, so the older ships would be scrapped, but those older ships' guns would probably still be retained at that point and could be repurposed on some very quickly built vessels, probably monitors and gunships and stuff like that. The other thing is, of course, what takes the place of Aboukir, Hogue and Cressy early in the war. So, granted, the tragedy of those ships and their men being lost was huge, but overall it didn't actually affect the Royal Navy's fighting capability all that much. But if the older armoured cruisers have gone to the scrapyard, what's there to teach the Royal Navy that lesson about not patrolling in the face of U-boats? Cisco Fan asks, in your Jutland series you said there was a brief period of confusion because the ground fleet was called to general quarters instead of action stations. Since in the US Navy battle stations and general quarters seem to be the same thing and equivalent to action stations in the Royal Navy, what was the difference between action stations and general quarters in the Royal Navy at the time? Well, the best answer comes from Sub-Lieutenant Boyer Smith aboard HMS Marlborough, which is where that account came from, and he accounts that general quarters was sounded, and he said it was a mistake. The bugle should have sounded action stations, not general quarters, which is an exercise action. And then, having reported to Y Turret, then he saw all the flags flying, etc. So basically, general quarters in the Royal Navy at the time, and possibly today, is everybody goes to your station, but that's all you're doing. You're not closing the ship up for battle, you're not anticipating enemy action. You could be ordered to general quarters for any number of reasons. It could be weather, it could be you're passing through a particular area, it could be going into port, or all sorts of things. Whereas action stations is very definitively, you are now going into battle, be prepared to fight. Also, the other difference, as far as I understand it, between general quarters and action stations in the Royal Navy in World War One, is general quarters means, okay, yeah, you might be in the mess, now go to your duty station. Action stations means not only go to your station and prepare for combat, but it also means close up the ship on your way through. So I guess the US equivalent would be putting the ship into condition zebra. Jeffrey Conley asks, USS Colorado's modernization was cancelled due to the war. Had the US Navy gone ahead, what would she possibly have looked like? Also, had the US Navy decided to raise her top speed from 21 to 23 knots in the interwar period, could it have been done without changing her hull form? Colorado didn't necessarily have her modernisation cancelled by the outbreak of World War II as far as the US was concerned. More that her full modernisation, as Admiral King wanted, was cancelled actually well before Pearl Harbor due to a combination of there was war elsewhere going on, and taking ships out of action for a prolonged period of time to modernise them was seen as unwise, and also that the Treasury had said that if you wanted to modernise the old ships, that would come out of the budget for new capital ship construction, and therefore the US Navy made the decision they would prefer to build more new ships than refit older ones. But she was in for a partial modernisation, mostly the addition of bulges and a few minor changes here and there. At the time that Pearl Harbor happened, then she was rushed through the remainder of her refit in order to get her back on duty as quickly as possible. If she'd had the budget and time available for a full modernisation the way that Admiral King wanted, then she probably would have come out looking something like her sister ship USS West Virginia, which was fully modernised because she basically needed to be rebuilt after the damage she took at Pearl Harbor. And as you can see here, that involves adding 8 twin 5-inch 38 mounts amidships, removing the 5-inch 25 and 5-inch 51 guns that were there already, and completely redoing the superstructure. Now, if she'd had a modernisation as per 1940-41, she may not have had the full superstructure redo that you see with West Virginia. She might still have kept one or the other of her cage mast, probably the foremast, but armament-wise and armour upgrade-wise, well, the West Virginia pretty much had the refit and modernisation, roughly speaking, that Admiral King wanted all of the Colorados to have. So that's a pretty good guideline, I would say. Primark 359 asks, were rifle caliber machine guns ever fitted aboard capital ships as anti-boarding weapons, or had other factors made boarding non-viable, and thus the non-boarding paradigm become dominant by the time machine guns became common? Well, it depends how you define rifle caliber machine gun. Certainly, as you can see here, Gatling guns were fitted as anti-boarding weapons on Royal Navy ironclads, along with Nordenfeldt machine guns, and both of these, whilst having a technical role as anti-torpedo boat weapons, were definitely talked about in terms of also being able to assist with preventing boarding actions. However, as you mentioned, as firepower developed, particularly long-range battleship firepower, boarding actions became less and less likely. However, most Royal Navy ships still had things like Lewis guns available, which are rifle caliber machine guns, and they were supplied with mounting points. Now, by World War One and then into World War Two, these Lewis gun mounts were mostly as a kind of a last-ditch anti-aircraft defence, but in theory, nothing prevents you from using them as an anti-boarding weapon or as a boarding weapon should you absolutely need to, if circumstances arise. However, by around about the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, the machine guns that were being installed aboard Royal Navy ships were no longer being installed for anti-boarding purposes. Pendon Harley asks, how were radio-controlled target ships such as USS Utah and HMS Centurion used during the interwar period? Did firing ships actually aim to hit them? And if so, how much damage would practice shells cause? Or were the target ships towing the actual targets? What benefits for the fleet were derived from such ships? So here's Centurion as a target ship being fired on. So yes, they did actually aim to hit the ships. In order to be used as a target ship, as you can see, they'd taken off all of her armament. They'd also put in a ton of cork to assist with buoyancy. Of course, removing all the armament significantly reduced her displacement, so in order to make sure that she was floating at the correct trim, as well as the cork, various areas were full of loose gravel or shingle in order to ensure that she had the right displacement. And the area where some of the crew were to be, and yes, there are people aboard this ship while she's being attacked, that was up-armoured. So it allowed the Royal Navy to do two things. One, it allowed them to test the effectiveness of different kinds of armour protection, because they could add armour in sections to test out the impact thereof. And it also meant that they had a live manoeuvring target to practice firing at, or indeed bombing. So what would happen is the ship would be made ready. She was actually converted from coal to oil firing to assist with the radio control methods. And then once the ship was set up and ready to go, the crew that remained on board, relatively minimal, would retire to beneath the armour deck within the citadel, beneath the areas that had been explicitly up-armoured for their protection. And then ships would lob shells and bombs of various practice natures at Centurion, and then the number of hits, so the level of accuracy and the damage caused by the hits, could then be assessed and then patched up later on and reused again and again. In the end, Centurion would need some patching up after extensive use by the fleet, and the damage caused by the shells and bombs, well, it depended. Were you firing an inert shell? Were you firing, a shell with full-on explosive, or dropping a bomb with full-on explosive? But as also mentioned, the ship was up-armoured in areas to withstand the hits, and also full of buoyant materials to ensure that even if you did blow holes in it, it was very unlikely to sink. And the benefit, as I mentioned, is essentially you get to practice in, well, the closest thing you can get to battle conditions that doesn't involve the enemy actually shooting back. Simon Me asks, Vince O'Hara in Clash of Fleets seems quite complimentary of Russia's attempts to dominate the Black Sea in World War I. Do you think their efforts are underrated, or was it of limited value considering they never managed to park a fleet in the Golden Horn? I think he's entirely correct to point out that the Russian efforts are somewhat underrated. It's not usually a theatre of World War I in the naval context that gets a lot of attention, but the Russians really were working from a lot of significant disadvantages in the run-up to and the start of World War I that they managed to overcome, because bear in mind, obviously, the Battle of Tsushima had torn the heart out of their pre-dreadnought fleet, so they only had a few pre-dreadnoughts left, most of which, ironically enough, were in the Black Sea. And then, having been left with that and a rather slow uptake on the construction of dreadnoughts, they were not in the world's worst position at the outbreak of war in 1914 with regards to the Ottoman Navy, which generally had a bunch of much older, fairly broken down vessels. But then, of course, Goeben and Breslau show up and tip the balance of power back in the Ottomans' favour, at least on paper. So, in theory, Goeben should have been able to cruise around the Black Sea, picking off pre-dreadnoughts at will and gradually establishing dominance. In practice, as I mentioned earlier in this Drydock, the Russians actually basically coordinated their pre-dreadnoughts in such a way as to make them a fairly difficult target for a single battle cruiser, and indeed Goeben would take on a squadron of Russian pre-dreadnoughts who were using exactly this tactic and ended up breaking away rather than continuing the engagement with the Russians. And then Goeben would later come across the Imperatrista Ekaterina, I think that's how it's pronounced, which is the ship that's gracing your screen at the moment, which was one of the Imperatrista Maria class, which was a derivative of the Ganguts built on the Black Sea. And by all accounts, the Russian battleship, although notionally, again on paper, in terms of arms and in terms of armament and armour, was roughly in the ballpark of Goeben, again, basically got the better of Goeben and sent her packing. So, given that they had the disadvantages of, the state of the crew training, such as was evidenced by the 2nd Pacific Squadron when it left in 1905, and a relatively reduced fleet having to deal with a dreadnought period warship in their midst, the Russians did a pretty good job to hold their own and work around the issues that they had. And maybe they never managed to quite park a fleet in the Golden Horn, but then neither did the British or the French, who were just on the other side of the Dardanelles, so that's not necessarily a mark against them. Riva asks, if the war hadn't messed things up and the British hadn't nicked all the ships that were due to the South American navies in the middle of their miniature naval arms race, how would the final navies have actually stacked up? Would there have been enough advantage on one side or the other to force an issue, or would things have been even enough for a fleet in being to still be a problem? And on a similar note, the Australians were determined over time to get their own navy assembled whilst they were still under British rule over the age of steam and steel, but even at its peacetime peaks, what good could it have actually have done in terms of relative capability in its chosen theatre, outside of simply being a semi-autonomous portion of the Royal Navy? As far as the Australian Navy is concerned, their main purpose was, at the time that they started everything going up, they were worried about mainly initially the Russians and then later other foreign navies who could show up to Australia, and bearing in mind that by the time you're talking about the commissioning of the battle cruiser HMS Australia and so forth, the Royal Navy is contracting its presence to concentrate more and more in European waters. So essentially what the Australians were worried about was foreign navies showing up and being able to intimidate, blockade or otherwise threaten Australia in a way that they perhaps had enough force to actually accomplish something before a Royal Navy presence could show up to, get rid of them. Or indeed, if there was a major war going, perhaps the Royal Navy presence wouldn't show up, at least for a good long while. So what the Australians were doing was essentially, in some ways, kind of a bit like Tirpitz's risk fleet strategy. By having Australia and a number of cruisers and destroyers, the idea was that the Royal Australian Navy was now big enough and scary enough that something like the East Asia Squadron, the German East Asia Squadron couldn't show up and tell them what to do, because if they tried, then Australia and her supporting vessels would sink them, which meant that if you then wanted to go and bully Australia, then regardless, even if the Royal Navy didn't have any ships there at all, you would have to come with a force that was big enough and mean enough to sink a full-on battle cruiser plus supporting vessels, which would mean at that kind of distance deploying at least 2 of your own battle cruisers or battleships plus supporting vessels. And there weren't that many navies in the world that could do that. Japan, bear in mind, was allied with Britain and therefore allied with the British Empire, so they weren't a threat. The Russians had only just about gotten around to building dreadnoughts, and they were building them in the Baltic and the Black Sea. The Italians didn't care. They were quite happy living in the Mediterranean. And the French didn't have any battle cruisers. They had precious few battleships in terms of dreadnoughts, so they weren't likely to be sending anything that size all the way over to Australia. And if the Germans tried anything, well, Germans had demonstrated a capability of deploying the odd battle cruiser here and there, but a German battle cruiser operating halfway across the planet with a relatively small naval base like Tsingtao at hand, the Germans aren't really going to risk a single battle cruiser versus a single battle cruiser action, especially given the Australians have the home field advantage. They'll have destroyers, they'll have, as mentioned, cruiser support ships, and that would therefore force pretty much the Germans, as the major threat by the time Australia is commissioned, to send a couple of battle cruisers, and if they send a couple of battle cruisers, they fatally weaken first scouting group in the face of the Royal Navy back in the North Sea, so they won't do that. Therefore, people will leave Australia alone. Now, as far as the South American navies are concerned, how would the final navies have actually stacked up? Well, the Chileans would have got both Almirante Litores. The Argentinians had a third optional battleship, but that was based on whether or not Brazil got a third. And given that Brazil had tried repeatedly to get a third battleship and kept on having to sell it, that's why what would eventually become Agincourt was temporarily belonging to the Ottomans at one point, having at some point been Rio de Janeiro. Now, there were obviously destroyers and cruisers also on order for all navies to form the support lines, but everyone at the time pretty much acknowledged that these are your screening and support vessels, but the main action, if there was any action, would be decided by conflict between the battleships. At which point, although the Brazilians started it off with the Minas Gerais, it also meant that they have the least capable of the three. And then how you stack up the Rivadavias versus the Litores is up to you. I personally favour the Litores. But of course, in 1914, the Brazilians were desperately trying to acquire Riachuelo, a 15-inch armed battleship. And I think everything would have depended on that. If the Brazilians had managed to get Riachuelo, that would have probably re-kick-started the whole thing, with Argentina and Chile also ordering similar responses of their own. Broadly, I think the Chileans would have come out with the strongest of the three navies, but whilst a endgame Chilean navy, either with or without its Riachuelo, answer if Brazil actually manages to pay for Riachuelo or not, whilst Chile could have probably defeated the Brazilian navy fairly comfortably, Chile versus Argentina, I think again Chile would have the advantage, but it would be very, very close, too close to call reliably, at which point you would have ended up with a fleet in being three-way, effectively, because whilst the Chileans notionally on paper could have defeated one or the other, they couldn't defeat both, and it was fairly clear during both the South American pre-dreadnought and the South American dreadnought races that the minute if any two went to war and it looked like one was going to beat the other, the third party, whoever that happened to be, would almost certainly jump in and stab the winning party in the back to ensure they weren't in a position to become dominant. So you would have had this weird three-way Mexican standoff going. Mark Griffith asks, there is the reasonably well-known Christmas Day ceasefire and game of football in World War I. Are there any similar naval Christmas truces, gift exchanges, or similar that you're aware of? Not that I'm aware of, although if anyone else is, and in various conflicts, feel free to chime in below, obviously. Basically because, obviously, on the Western Front, everybody was couple of 100 yards, if that, away from each other in trenches. So if they decided they weren't going to fight that day and were going to interact with each other, then they could. Whereas Christmas Day 1914 for the Royal Navy and the High Seas Fleet, they were hundreds of miles away from each other, and it's much, much more difficult to justify putting a warship alongside the enemy, even if they had encountered each other for some kind of peaceful exchange. And similarly, in previous conflicts, I'm not aware of any particular naval détente as a result of a Christmas Day or other similar celebration. If they were so inclined, well, the chances of ships meeting up on a particular day is relatively slim anyway. But you also have to remember that when you're talking about at least the larger scale naval conflicts, you're either talking about time, late winter, when ships might well be back in their home ports in earlier periods, or in later periods where you would have a certain degree of religious difference going on. Obviously, Napoleonic Wars, technically the Republican French, for a while at least, abolished Christmas, as far as I'm aware at least. And you have, England versus France or England versus Spain for a lot of the latter part of the second millennium AD. You have Protestants versus Catholics, so there'd be a lot of rather charged emotions going on there. So there's not really so much of the capability to do so, even if they'd wanted to. But as I said, if someone knows about some odd niche little Christmas truce that a pair of ships or two navies brokered at some point in history, let's hear about it. Riva asks, in the time period you cover, have situations arisen where the pride and or biggest ship of a given navy is a logistics craft rather than a military one? And what would the closest equivalents have been, and why did they come about? There have been a few situations where this kind of thing has arisen, mostly in the period that the channel covers. I mean, if you're looking at the era of steam and steel, at least, rather than going back into the age of sail, once you get into the 1890s onwards, it pops up a few times. Specifically where you're looking at navies who are dependent on destroyers or similar sized vessels as their primary combatants, or they might have maybe a single small cruiser, something that was maybe a protected cruiser left over from World War One. Because at that point, if you have a decent sized submarine tender or resupply tanker, that's going to be the biggest ship in your navy by a considerable margin. So, for example, here, I believe this is the Yugoslavian tanker Perun, which was the largest vessel, as far as I can tell, in the Yugoslavian Navy at the outbreak of World War II. They had one small ex-German, I think, cruiser from World War I that was about 2,900 tons, something like that. But Perun was 4,600, and everything else in the Yugoslavian Navy was a destroyer or smaller. So, therefore, this tanker was the single largest craft in the Yugoslavian Navy, and it was a logistics vessel. I haven't been able to track down exactly what the Polish Navy had in terms of submarine tenders and so forth, but given that the Gryf was that kind of weird hybrid training ship, mine layer, destroyer, was their biggest active combat vessel at the start of World War II, if they had anything similar, repair ship, supply ship, logistics ship, etc., then that would be the biggest technical vessel in their navy. Alec Hruby asks, several older British battleships never received increased elevation, and as you said several times, they received superchargers instead. My first question is, did they use them only for long-range fire, or would there have been precedent where they could fire them at closer ranges for increased penetration? Secondly, would supplying the other battleships that did receive increased elevation modifications or were otherwise built without superchargers be a good idea or not, i.e. in the battle between King George V and Rodney against Bismarck, would this help King George V penetrate Bismarck's belt better and put the ship down faster? And thirdly, did the ships that didn't receive the modifications, was this due to economic factors or something else? So the ships that didn't receive the modified elevation to their turrets, basically that came about because they hadn't been through the modernisation process that some of the ships like Valiant, as you can see here, had done. Because to remove the turrets, to take them away, take everything apart, increase the elevation mechanisms on the guns, and then obviously recut the turret gun portholes, etc., and add all the relevant equipment to allow for that in deeper gun pits and so on and so forth. That's quite extensive work, so it would only really be done when the ship's being fully modernised, and there were only a limited number of ships that got modernised. Partly, yes, economic factors, they could only afford to do so many, and partly also dockyard limitations. There were only so many battleship-sized docks active in the late 1930s in the UK, actually a lot less than there were back in the 1920s and 1910s, but never mind. Would giving battleships that had their elevation increased with giving them superchargers be a good idea, or giving King George V superchargers be a good idea? With the ships that had their elevation increased, I don't think it would have been a good idea, because if I recall correctly, one of the reasons they weren't given the superchargers was because at the higher elevations, the gun pits and the recoil systems wouldn't be able to handle the recoil from them, whereas at lower elevations, the original gun pits for up to 20 degrees elevation could, and the benefits outweighed the negatives. And with something like a King George V or a Nelson class, I mean, you could make the argument in theory that superchargers would give you better penetration, but the Royal Navy was broadly speaking happy with the penetration they expected to get off of those guns at the expected battle ranges, and so cutting into your regular ammunition supply for a fairly unique, relatively little used charge that would in any case cause a bit more wear and tear to the gun and would require a completely different set of firing tables, it was just judged basically as not being worth it. And going into the primary question element, did they only use them for long-range fire, or was there precedent for opening fire at close range? Well, none of the ships that received the supercharges actually ended up fighting at very close range. The only exception to that being Barham at Cape Matapan, but, well, at that kind of range she didn't really need superchargers to deal with a couple of Zara class, really, did she? And as for long-range fire, although they were issued to the ships to be able to use them at long range, there doesn't appear to be any significant evidence of them actually using them. Which, I mean, okay, it's not as though Malaya, Barham, Repulse and the R's got into all that many gunfights, but there are one or two instances where perhaps using the superchargers could have been useful, especially some of the earlier battles with Italian ships in the Mediterranean, because on at least two occasions you end up with Warspite up in the lead, quite happily engaging Italian warships, especially Calabria, where she's engaging Giulia Cesare, and there are older, slower battleships coming up somewhat behind, and they're shooting to cause distraction, but their shells are falling well short. If they'd used superchargers in those cases, then they may well have actually been able to reach out and hit the Italian ships, but they don't seem to have been using them for whatever reason. I haven't looked into whether or not the captains of those ships gave any particular justification or thought to give a justification as to why they didn't use superchargers in those cases, but it might have been useful at that point. Maybe Cesare might not have gotten away if, for example, if I think Malaya had been able to get another couple of 1,000 yards on her maximum range shots. And so what you have instead is Warspite having to double back to allow everyone else to catch up, which then allows the Italians time to withdraw. Ed Rusa asks, did naval attachés or observers ever end up taking a combat or leadership role in a time of need on a ship that they happen to be on? It does seem to have happened, but relatively rarely. The system of naval attachés and observers really is a little bit of a flash in the pan. It still technically goes on, but not quite in the way it did during the Age of Steam and Steel. So the idea of having a foreign navy's representative or observer aboard for various purposes does actually have quite a long and broad history, but the kind of situation that you're asking about, nowadays, the systems would be far too complex and in some cases too classified for someone to get involved in, even if they wanted to be. Very different from what might be in their own navy for the most part. And in the age of sail, usually someone who was aboard would be a very honoured guest, and potentially usually a noble or something like that, maybe even royalty. And so they wouldn't really have much concept of how to get involved, and they'd probably just get in the way. If you had another captain aboard or some other kind of naval officer, that might be different, but at that point they're more likely to just be temporarily signed up as part of the crew anyway. So then that sort of lands you in this late 19th, early 20th century bracket where you have someone who is a full serving officer and properly trained from another navy, who happens to be aboard a ship that may then end up in combat, but is there at a time where the systems that are being used are familiar enough to them that they can jump in and help if necessary. Now, the sort of poster child for this is at Tsushima, which, as I've mentioned before, one of the naval attachés just jumped in and started serving on a gun crew because, well, people were shooting at him, and just because he was an attaché didn't really mean that an incoming naval shell wasn't going to blow him to pieces, so he was quite invested in shooting back. But this also reflects another aspect of the attaché system, specifically around the late 19th and early 20th century, where you might have multiple observers from multiple navies at multiple ranks who might be then fairly freely distributed around the ship, so that if half a gun crew gets wiped out and an attaché takes an umbrage to this, they are in a position to just jump in. Whereas sort of immediately thereafter, if you look even into in World War II, for example, you might only have one or two attachés aboard, unless it's a visiting admiral with his entire staff. But whatever the case, they're usually going to be on the bridge, at which point, if a gun turret or a secondary gun mount gets hit, it's multiple decks away and there's nothing really that they can do about it. And if the bridge gets hit and everyone gets blown up, well, they're just as likely to be blown up as anybody else. And if there are survivors, it would be an incredibly weird circumstance if the attaché survives and nobody from the local bridge crew does. So, and if they're one of the survivors, they might pitch in a little bit to help out, but the surviving bridge crew are going to be the main ones in charge. Now, I've heard in passing about one or two other attachés getting involved, but the only one I can actually specifically point to this happening is at Tsushima. But in the broader arc of sort of 1860 to 1920 naval combat, I suspect it probably happened a few more times than that. Andre Descoult asks, I remember several Drydock questions about Royal Sovereign and its tenure as Arkhangelsk, I think that's how it's pronounced, on loan to the USSR. There was discussion about its poor material state at the end of the war and the fact its turrets were unable to rotate. Why was this? Presumably one or a combination of factors, including, I guess, would be maybe rust, dried up grease, excessive paint, solid diffusion if they hadn't moved, and others. Would these same reasons apply to current museum battleships like the Iowas in relation toward feasibility for reactivation? Well, it definitely wasn't excessive paint, I can assure you of that. The reports by Royal Navy officers upon receipt of Royal Sovereign, when the Soviets returned her, were less than complimentary. They mentioned, hatches that should have been sealed to keep the weather out having been left open, quite evident from water intrusion and rust. The guns had obviously not been moved at all for ages. There were rats everywhere, and there are rats normally on ships, but this was really bad. And they also noted that significant portions of Royal Sovereign's more advanced equipment were missing, presumed stolen. So it seemed to be honest, like the Russians or the Soviets at the time had basically not really done much with her other than loot the ship and use it as a place to store a few sailors that they presumably didn't like that much. It seems that if she did anything at all, it was sailing out briefly to meet an incoming convoy and then going straight back into port again, which wasn't exactly taxing on her systems. So Yeah, she just wasn't really taken care of. Rust would therefore be a problem if they're not taking care of her properly. Dried up grease, similarly. Solid diffusion, that, where metal effectively kind of welds itself together if it's under enough weight and you leave it in place for long enough, that could also have been a significant problem. As far as how that applies to museum ships, if they were going to try and reactivate them, museum ships have a significantly better care taken of them. So, they're constantly fighting with the rust. They do try to keep the things that need greasing greased up where possible. With most museum ships, I'd be more worried about the long-term perishing of things like rubber, hoses and seals and so forth than anything else, assuming that, it's not like poor old Massachusetts, who had half her machinery plant robbed by the US Navy during the Iowa's reactivation. Solid diffusion could be more of a problem, though, especially now the ships have been out of service for quite a few years. But that would then come down to, are the turrets and guns elevated or moved at all? So I know, for example, New Jersey can hand elevate her guns, but I don't know about rotating the turrets. So I don't think the rust or the dried up grease would be a problem, but over a long period of time, solid diffusion might be a problem on some ships. Sui420 Den asks, some of the early US pre-dreadnoughts used 13-inch main guns, but then the US moved to 12-inch guns in their later pre-dreadnoughts and early dreadnoughts. Why go with a smaller caliber, and are there other cases of navies choosing to go with smaller guns on their new capital ships if they weren't subject to treaty limitations? It comes down to weight and firepower, because the 13-inch gun actually weighs quite a lot. So although it's only a 35 caliber length weapon, it actually weighs more than any 12-inch gun that the US put into service. In fact, the US wouldn't see a heavier gun on its battleships until the 14-inch 45 caliber weapons were introduced on USS New York and USS Texas. So there's a fairly hefty weight implication. Okay, it's only a matter of maybe 5 to 10 tons, but multiply that across, at least in the pre-dreadnoughts, 4 guns, and 40 tons, that's suddenly almost the weight of another entire main caliber gun or a bunch of armour. And part of it is related to why gun calibers or gun lengths start extending, and that's because of the invention of new powders that don't burn quite as quickly as the old black powder charges, therefore you get more of an impulse out of them. And basically you could get more armor penetration out of a smaller caliber weapon, which meant that the guns, therefore could weigh less, and therefore you could carry more other guns, more secondaries, or more armor, or more power plant, or just save money generally. And if you could do that and still get better armor penetration, then there was no need to have an even bigger gun, because if you had enough armor penetration to get through the armor of your likely targets at your expected battle ranges, then over penetration is pointless. So you might as well save the weight either for more guns of the same caliber or more other things like we just mentioned. So for example, when you compare the 13-inch 35 caliber weapon on the early US pre-dreadnoughts, and then you contrast that with a 12-inch 40 caliber weapon that replaced it on subsequent classes, you find that although at 12,000 yards their armor penetration is about the same, at 9,000 yards the 12-inch gun has actually significantly better armor penetration by about 2 inches over the 13-inch gun. And, so right at the extreme edge where it's about equal, that's probably because the 13-inch obviously is a slightly heavier shell. But given that at the time these ships are being constructed, you're gonna be lucky. Given say Battle of Tsushima, you're fighting at 5,000 or 6,000 yards. You're not going to be fighting at 12,000 yards. So in most regimens, the 12-inch gun offers A, more than enough penetration to punch through the armor of likely opponents. B, it offers a better capability than the 13-inch weapon. And therefore C, it's also a lighter weapon that gives you more performance, so why would you need anything larger? Whereas once you get into later periods, no one makes a similar radical advancement in propellant technology, at which point it's just usually worth getting bigger and bigger guns. And I don't think, well, outside of treaty limitations like the King George V, I don't think anyone really went down in caliber on their new capital ships. I suppose you could maybe make an argument that the Germans went down in caliber on their battle cruisers, considering that Bayern and Baden came first and they had 15-inch, but they were looking at 13.8-inch on the Mackensons. But then they are battle cruisers, not battleships, so they follow a slightly different design lineage, and the Mackensons still have more bigger guns than the Der Flingers did. Lord Nelson asks, let's say some sailors from a crack frigate crew bring a lucrative prize back into Portsmouth whilst the frigate itself is staying on station. Given the ubiquitous manpower shortages of the Napoleonic Wars, the sailors are not sent back to their frigate but are rather unceremoniously taken aboard some larger ships and scattered around the fleet. Would they still get their share of prize money? Well, a couple of things. Firstly, if the sailors are signed up to a particular ship in the Age of Sail, bearing in mind that the ship's commission and crew for a single voyage assignment, etc., and then are paid off again, they are much, much more attached to that ship, both obviously personally and legally, than they would be in later periods. So it would be pretty difficult to just wholesale take a prize crew and say, no, actually, you know what, you're going on a bunch of other ships, because unless they're impressed men, if they're volunteers, they have already signed up and have a legal contract with the Navy for a particular ship and a particular voyage under a particular captain. But that's not to say it couldn't happen. It could, and at points probably did. Now, if that does happen, there is the technical and practical side of things. So technically, they would be absolutely eligible for their share of the prize money, because they were part of the crew. There would be crew rosters from the frigate to support that they were part of the crew at the time of the capture, and therefore they are eligible for their share of the prize money. But from a more practical perspective, them actually getting it would be quite difficult. Again, technically, the Admiralty, if they can't find some of the crew because they sent them off on some other ship, should hold the prize money for them. But it would, I suspect, with the way things worked at the time, it would probably be down to that crewman when he eventually gets back from whatever ship he's been assigned to go to the Admiralty offices or the prize court in question and say, hey, look, I was on this ship, you this time I'm eligible for this prize money, you sent me off to here, so I'm now coming back to claim what's rightfully mine, at which point the Navy would have to look up its records and cough up. But the onus, unfortunately, would be very, very much on the poor man who's got shuffled off into who knows where to actually chase it up. The Admiralty certainly isn't going to be chasing him to give him a bunch of money. Robert Knapp asks, in The Royal Navy in Eastern Waters by Andrew Boyd, he quotes a paper by the Director of Naval Intelligence from 1944 where the two Fuso and Issei class battleships are ranked by the Royal Navy as being superior to the modernised Queen Elizabeths, and the Congos are ranked as superior to Renown. Why do you think this was, and was it accurate? It feels well off by both counts, especially on the Queen Elizabeth's front. Yeah, that's very badly off. It wouldn't be the first time British naval intelligence had made similarly hilariously pessimistic analysis. I mean, apart from anything, by the end of 1944, the Fusos didn't exist anymore. The US Navy had dealt with them, so yeah. And the Isseis had been converted into hybrids, you know, right near the beginning, if not earlier. So yeah, I don't think anyone can argue with a straight face that the Isseis, with their hybrid form, are in any way, shape or form competitive with the refit QEs, and the Fusos either. I mean, when you consider it, the Fusos and Isseis are slower than the QEs. They're significantly less well protected than the QEs. The only on-paper advantage they have, at least before they, to hybridize the Isseis, is they do have 12 guns versus 8, when you look at gun elevation, both ships can fire out past practical engagement ranges, so that doesn't make too much odds. Although some of the Japanese turrets can elevate a little bit higher. But again, as I say, that doesn't make too much odds, really. And of course, the Royal Navy has the full suite of modernised fire control systems and radar, which in 1944 the Fusos and the Iseis most definitely do not. And then when you look at the Congos versus Renown, Renown is a little bit better protected. Not a huge amount, but somewhat. Speed is broadly similar, although Renown has a fraction of a knot edge, but near as much as makes a difference the same. And again, firepower-wise, yes, the Congos have four sets of twin turrets as opposed to Renown's 3, but then Renown has the 15-inch, which hits somewhat harder and is overall just a better gun. And in a lot of the ways, the argument is basically repeated compared to Queen Elizabeth and Fuso and Issei. Everyone can reach out beyond any reasonable battle distance, so that kind of works out overall. But the Renown again has better fire control in the form of radar, etc., etc., etc. So yeah, maybe Renown's margin of advantage is a bit less than that of Queen Elizabeth, which does have a significant armour benefit compared to Renown, but they are both superior to the Japanese units. But as I said, this wouldn't be the first time British naval intelligence dropped the ball a bit when it came to estimations, because while I was doing the research for Admiral Cunningham's ongoing biography on the channel, I came across the fact that in the immediate run-up to the war, for example, British naval intelligence told the Prime Minister that the Mediterranean fleet couldn't take on the Regia Marina. And when at the time Admiral Fisher and Admiral Cunningham got hold of that report, they basically took one look at it, and after angrily laughing at it for a good 15 minutes, basically considered it kindling, because they had no idea what someone captaining a desk back in the UK thought or where he was getting his information from, but as far as they were concerned, it was completely inaccurate. So I think that's probably a similar thing to what's going on here. But then, given that the British thought that the Japanese had completed a bunch of 12-inch supercruisers before the war even started, you could say their intelligence when it came to Japanese vessels was not necessarily the greatest. Oh, and before anyone points out that the rebuilds of Fuso and Issei technically put their on-paper speed up to about the same as a refitted Queen Elizabeth, yes, on paper. However, I'd remind you that by 1944, the Fusos and Isseis, apart from being sunk at the end of the year and or converted into hybrids, had gone through a lot of wear and tear without a tremendous amount of work being done on them. And at this point, the Japanese Navy is running on effectively near as much as makes no difference raw crude. And if you think at that point they're going to get anywhere close to what their on-paper speeds are after their initial modernizations, well, I've got a bridge to sell you. Lord Quack, King of Ducks, asks, the Allied voice encryption system SIGSALY was massive and required immense resources to use. However, the US Navy put one on a ship for Pacific theatre operations. Is there any evidence the Royal Navy would have followed suit for the British Pacific Fleet if the atomic bombs hadn't ended the war? I highly doubt it, because the system that actually went to sea seems to have been put together at the insistence of General MacArthur to follow him around, which probably tells you everything you need to know about what the US Navy thought about that in general, and their own usage of it in particular, because it doesn't seem that anyone like any of the US admirals had any particular inclination to use it whilst at sea. And to be perfectly honest, if you gave the option to the British and they looked at it and went, so what's this for? Oh, it allows you to have encrypted real-time voice communication with senior officers and the government back in London. You wouldn't even finish the sentence before you'd be unceremoniously chucked out the nearest porthole. So, yeah, given that the general US Navy policy doesn't seem to have been to use the thing whilst at sea, I don't think the Royal Navy would have particularly wanted it either. British higher echelons were using it, to be sure, on land, but at sea, I think the Royal Navy officers would have much preferred to go with the standard communication systems for long-distance communication, and at close range, You know, if they could talk to each other on various ships using a nice highly encrypted voice communication system, I'm sure they would have jumped at the chance, but that's not what SIGSALY was designed for. Andrew Waite asks, Google Street Map, link below, shows a large naval gun outside of the Jolly Sailor pub at 54 Clarence Parade in Southsea. Could you please calculate where the shell fired from this gun would land, and if you think it would simply make a big splash at sea to the south of Hayling Island, could you also determine where it would land if the gun were to swivel by 180 degrees? Now, I have actually seen this gun before when I've been down at Portsmouth, and a few times I've actually been in the pub as well. It's not a bad pub. But I've actually tried to work out which gun it is, but unfortunately, as you can see, it is a little bit rusted. So any identifying marks on the breech have either been painted over or rusted away long ago, and there's no real signage around there either to tell you what exactly it is. So I don't know exactly what kind of gun it is. It's clearly, you know, one of the smaller ones as far as naval guns are concerned. I think it might be a 4-inch 40, but I don't know to be certain. If someone does know what exact make and model of gun this is, then please let us know in the comments below, and then I can, if I'm wrong, do a recalculation. And there's also range figures for 2 different shells that the gun used, but nonetheless, if we assume that it is indeed a 4-inch 40, and it appears to be elevated at around about 20 degrees. So if you did fire it in the alignment that it's in at the moment, it would, just splash into the sea somewhere south of Hayling Island. But if you flip it around, it's actually got a range, depending on, again, which shell you use, of either almost 8.8 kilometres or just over 9.5 kilometres. If you use the slightly shorter range shell, then it's probably going to crash down. It's going to completely clear Portsmouth, completely clear Gosport and a good chunk of Lyon Solent, and it's going to crash down somewhere north, for those of you who are familiar with the area, just north of the B3334, the Gosport Road, between Peel Common roundabout and the junction with Daedalus Way, just in what looks to be just a farmer's field. If you use the slightly longer range shell that extends it to just over 9.5 kilometres, then the shell's going to just about touch down, I think, a couple of dozen yards east of what appears to be a football pitch associated with Crofton Secondary School, which is just a little bit further west. So, they might have a bit of a surprise just on the east outskirts of Stubbington. And that wraps us up for this month. Thank you very much for listening, everyone, and if indeed you still are, you've survived this far, and see you all again in another video sometime soon. Bye.